Welcome to the In the Box podcast. I'm Jeff, and today we're going to talk about homebrew, and specifically homebrew in fantasy TTRPGs. And recently I was listening to someone in the Dungeon Tube sphere talk about how homebrew is all icky and scary, bad, and we shouldn't do it. How did we go from everyone coming up with their own stuff to people saying homebrew like it's some kind of scary word? Now, I have a few theories on this. The first theory is the biggest elephant in the room, Wizards of the Coast, probably doesn't want you creating anything yourself. And I know, okay, yeah, DM's Guild and what little they allow on D&D Beyond that isn't like some kind of corporate handshake. I really don't think they want you creating for yourself because then they can't sell you whatever they've come up with for D&D Beyond and the campaign of the quarter, I guess is what they're doing now. I don't know, it's weird. But back in the BECME era, which for those who aren't familiar is the basic expert companion masters immortals Dungeons and Dragons, we homebrewed literally everything. We hadn't even gotten into Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms. It was just this weekend we're running Jeff's world. Next weekend, we're running in Travis's world, and then so on and so forth, with each one of us kind of taking turns as dungeon master. Now, the funny thing was there were a couple of us that were really enthusiastic about dungeon mastering, and a couple of us that were really not fans. But the point being is, I mean, sometimes we didn't even have maps for the world. We just knew it was this person's world, and what they say goes. And if there's a map, great. I mean, at one point, I had a circle at the center of a piece of notebook paper, and it had 5 days ride to this village here, and 5 days ride to this town here, or 3 days ride down here to this little tiny village, and just so on and so forth. They were just dots on the map with like marks as to how far it would take to get there by horseback. Uh, and that was just kind of how we did it. And then dungeons were kind of other dots on the map. And yeah, we just kind of went from there. And I don't even think like half the time we had a name for the realm or the plane or whatever we were adventuring on. I know at one point we ended up in the astral plane with one campaign. That was kind of cool. But so then a little later on, games like Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms and even Greyhawk were great when nobody knew the canon at the time, unless you read all the Dragonlance books or you were big into Forgotten Realms from the novels, or you ran into Ed Greenwood at a convention because he basically is Elminster. But we didn't know a whole lot about some of these things because, of course, small town Iowa, not a lot of access to the various fantasy novels. And if you try to check out the latest Dragonlance novel at the library, chances are somebody beat you to it. Might even be one of the guys in our own group. Uh, and just kind of how it went. But like it was a lot of fun because like we were playing characters that we'd never had before, and there's no clerics. There's no if you popped up in Ravenloft, there's not a lot of clerical magic. There's no paladins. There's it was all kind of up in the air, like we didn't know what we were walking into from one day to the next. Now, I will say, when I got the big gray box set, which I can still see from here, it's next to my desk, I read pretty much everything in that box, uh, cover to cover. I was absolutely fascinated with Forgotten Realms and the hex crawl or the hex mapping aspect of it, and the fact that the map was gigantic, the world was gigantic, and here they've like filled in things that are kind of going on in this, that, and the other area, but it still hadn't gotten to the point of Elminster teleports into the tavern and hands you this quest and you don't have a choice, go. It wasn't like that. And we didn't have like 20 players all trying to be Dritzed, and we didn't have, Spellfire as a character option until way, way later. Uh Prepackaged content has always been a suggestion to me anyway. My third edition Greyhawk campaign literally kept some of the place names, like it kept the map the same. Everything else was completely different. I had Kelethin from the EverQuest RPG, tabletop RPG no less. just because it was one of my favorite locations. We had all kinds of stuff going from, I ran some of the stuff out of Glades of Death. I ran some stuff out of the AEG adventure books, Dungeon Crawl Classics modules before they were ever in Dungeon Crawl Classics, the game. They were third edition DCC modules, which was a lot of fun. But I mean, like all I had left was the map. Because I needed quote unquote grid references, to use kind of a military term. I needed to know about where things were placed and what they were called. That was it. That was all I did. Because honestly, I really don't take any given core prepackaged D&D content seriously. Now, I will say that it's a little different with Dragonbane. I've been running around in the adventure book for Dragonbane and the Path of Glory adventures, and now I've just gotten Arcand, City of Waves and Flames, and I'll be kind of messing around with that. But that's like closer to like actual prepackaged content. And for Dragonbane, I think it's just fine because a lot of it, at least here in the United States, hasn't already been run to death. It's all kind of fresh to us, especially a lot of the solo gaming stuff is fresh to us here in the United States, just because we didn't grow up with Drakarok Demeter. And God, I wish we had. Um, I don't think it would have flown with TSR being their main competitor, but you never know. Tunnels and Trolls lasted a lot longer than people give it credit for. In fact, it's still going. Anyway, yeah, everything back then, a lot of games now lost to the winds of time. Back in the old days, were just Xeroxed and distributed to the gaming club or your family or anybody that showed interest. The old guys that pioneered the hobby would, like the old grognards, not the newer grognards, which is a little confusing, but yeah, back in the old pioneer days of TTRPGs, like the old fart war gamers would look at us and go, "Oh, you're role playing. That'll never last. Your hobby will be dead in 5 years." And we're just like, okay, dude, whatever. Back to D&D. Um, you know, and a lot of the wargaming clubs kind of frowned on role playing activity. We were considered a side game or something to do between rounds of wargaming tournaments and board game tournaments and things like that. And nobody thought it was going to last. And so, yeah, like a lot of us, like our introduction to D&D was like some world that somebody just cooked up, and handed out. Especially back in the old days. I seem to recall something about Dave Arneson's group had a lot of their stuff was just like photocopies and handwritten notes and things like that. Like they didn't have anything really formal until later on. And in a twist of irony, absolute irony to me anyway, Gary Gygax encouraged dungeon masters to create their own worlds and their own campaigns and their own dungeons and their own adventures and even their own classes and spells and monsters and all that. In fact, I kind of want to say it was the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, which I just adore that book even now. Like, darn near 35 years later, I'm still really just enamored with the advice and some of the stuff from that book because Gygax, that was back in the old days, and Gygax had really poured his heart and soul into it. It was supposed to kind of be the one D&D uh, until second edition came along, but that wasn't completely his fault. Um, and that's not to say there's anything wrong with second edition, because actually I really like second edition AD&D. I've got multiple copies of the various incarnations of it sitting around here somewhere, but I'm a huge 2E fan too, so but yeah, 1E was supposed to be the end all and be all, but yeah, Gary Gygax encouraged us. Like it wasn't, here, buy my stuff. And the Forgotten Realms at the time was not the default campaign setting. Like there was no default campaign setting back in the old days. Even up through third edition, there was no, in fact, fourth edition to be more precise. There was no real you're playing in the Forgotten Realms, or you're always playing in some form of Planescape, or you're always playing in some form of. I hear that there's kind of a rumor that the next edition is going to go back to Greyhawk, but we'll see what happens. And that is a rumor, so don't go telling people, "Oh my gosh, Jeff's Gamebox told me that Greyhawk is totally going to be the next default D." No, I don't know that. I wish I did. I wish I knew what to tell you guys. But second edition D&D, just kind of taking a half a step back here, had some really, really phenomenal game settings, and they all came out. I don't want to say all at the same time, but they were coming out rapid fire there for a while in the 80s and 90s. Holy cow. And everybody wanted to try the newest thing that came out. So when Maztica came out, we played game in Maztica. So like when Spelljammer came out, everybody wanted to play in Spelljammer. But everybody wanted to play in Dark Sun. I mean, I was jamming on Dark Sun when it came out because holy cow, that was like a whole different world. All of the old tropes that we've all kind of grown up on got thrown right out the window with Dark Sun. It was a whole different world. Personally, I am a huge fan of Zakara, which is the kind of Arab setting, Arabian setting for D&D second edition. Yeah, big fan, But yeah, we all had to try out the latest and greatest because Al-Qadim, that was the name I was trying to think of. So yeah, like Al-Qadim, Land of Zakara, a lot of fun. And again, completely different world setting, completely different view of things, vaguely tied to the Forgotten Realms, not really. Kind of the same way Karatur was vaguely tied to the Forgotten Realms. And even if I recall correctly from looking at the back of the Karatur book, there was even a tie-in with Greyhawk, but Greyhawk had kind of its own separate version of Karatur, which is confusing as all get out, if you ask me. But yeah, we wouldn't have a hobby without Homebrew. Because I mean, I can't count the number of other worlds, especially when third edition D&D rolled around. Holy buckets! When that open gaming license kicked in, I think everybody and their dog released a home brew world of some sort that they've just kind of formalized and sent out into the world. Cut, we'll get that in post. Everybody had kind of a homebrew campaign that they formalized and put out into the world. Iron Kingdoms and Dragon Star, and because that was D&D in space done right. Strange though it was, stuff that had mostly existed as homebrew prior to third edition. I mean, look at Dungeon Crawl Classics. I mean, there's a perfect example of what was obviously somebody's game in the 70s and 80s come to life in fantasy game terms. And some games have stood the test of time, like entire game systems have stood the test of times, and others haven't as much. I mean, Earth Dawn, there's a perfect example of a game that popped up. It was quite obviously quote unquote home brewed until FASA got a hold of it and then made it a formal thing. And it's survived, I think, 3 or 4 incarnations now, but it's still kind of running around out there on the internet. If you search for it, I'm sure you can probably find some form of it. And then, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, there's another good one where somebody, took their love for the Warhammer Fantasy miniatures and turned it into a full-blown role-playing game. I mean, again, our hobby wouldn't exist. And even now, I mean, not just like open gaming license stuff, but like full-blown entire worlds and entire game settings. I mean, look at Draw Steel and Daggerheart and Shadow Dark, and even the brand new hasn't even been released yet that just got funded on BackerKit a little while ago, Rudiger's Almanac. People saying I can rebuild it better than D&D. I can make a world that is D&D only punchier, cooler, can do this one thing that I was never allowed to do in D&D. And some of these games came from someone asking to homebrew something that wasn't in D&D at the time. So maybe they wanted to make Flash from DC or Spider-Man in D&D, and someone wanted a spaceship to explore the galaxy in. And we couldn't do a lot of that stuff in D&D, especially back in the old days. Some game systems come from creators not wanting to try to fit the D&D mold. In fact, a lot of former D&D creators broke off and did their own thing, and universe bless them for that, because there's just so many awesome things that came from not wanting to fit the D&D mold. I mean, look at Call of Cthulhu. GURPS is still around even now. And I'm here to tell you, back when it started, GURPS was like the hottest thing going. Rifts from Palladium. Actually, I've spoken to Kevin C. Mbieta a long time ago at a convention, and he told me, it's like he didn't want to do D&D. I mean, yes, there is Palladium Fantasy, and Palladium Fantasy is an awesome system, and it looks a little bit like D&D, but not exactly. Um, you know, Traveler, there's another good one. Somebody wanted to make a space game that was strictly a hard science fiction game. There was no laser swords and blasters and a galactic empire that ruled okay, it's Traveler. But I mean, it was more like NASA science based. It was more of a, and I mean, and it was more of a, Traveler was more of a hard science game, and obviously never fit into D&D, at least not back in the day. I mean, TSR had their own space game with so TSR had their own thing with Star Frontiers and Gamma World to a certain extent. And really, other than Traveler, I have not found a hard science fiction game that does it quite as well as Traveler does. Now, my only criticism of Traveler is if you're playing like canon rules as written Traveler, it feels like I could almost build the thing in my backyard faster than I can build it on paper in their system, uh, which I've been saying for years. Because it is a hard science fiction game. Like, you have to know some degree of general science if you really want to play Traveler well. But yeah, there are some games that came out of TSR or WotC not wanting to hire the creator. And these companies, these bigger companies, are notorious for requiring writers to have already had been published somewhere else. And that was a big roadblock, especially when I was growing up and I was coming up through the college years and whatnot. I talked to Dave Gross once, and again, this was many years ago. I doubt he remembers me. Once told me, that if I wanted to work at what was at the time TSR, that I had to build a resume before he'd even look at my work to get published in Dragon. And yeah, and Dragon was kind of the doorway. So was Dungeon Magazine into TSR at the time. And then a little later on, Wizards of the Coast. And Wizards of the Coast, as far as I can tell, still has some pretty rigid parameters as to who they will hire. So if you didn't get hired, at TSR or Wizards of the Coast later on, you went off and did your own thing. And that was how we got GURPS. And that was how we got, I'm trying to think of who the other one was. Well, that's how we got Pathfinder. That's how we got Castles and Crusades, is, between former writers and people that just did not get hired or could not get hired at TSR. Gary Gygax happened to be one of those early Troll Lord Games employees, in fact. Come to think of it, because Gary got kicked out of his own company and wanted to still do some stuff and wanted to still write fantasy and be part of the hobby. So how did we get here? I mean, I think the majority of the problem comes when players especially try to min-max the Dungeons and Dragons system. When someone comes to the dungeon/game master with some outrageously warped character class of their own design or subclass, the player's asking, you mean I can't start with this build that I saw some dungeon tuber cheese together? It does kind of make Homebrew look terrible, when you see stuff like that. And I mean, that's never been totally acceptable. Now, that's not to say I don't encourage players to be creative. You want to, get creative with your character, that's cool. You want to give me a background I haven't seen before, You want to, come up with a reason why you have your father's sword, but it's not magical. You are not starting my game with a +1 sword unless we start at like 3rd level, and even then. Um, stuff like that. I don't want players coming to me with their own special skill called head lopping or some new spell called head explosion, because it's just not going to work, especially at low levels. And sometimes you have to explain these things to people. Players especially, they have what looks like a brilliant idea. It's like, no, you're not starting the game with with an infinity stone burned into your forehead and belonging to some psionic class, because right there is a red flag for me. That you've designed yourself and has like all these cool crazy powers that aren't in the book for a 1st level or even 2nd or 3rd level character. I mean, there are some hard limits, especially with this newfangled 5e or 5.5e, where it seems like there's hundreds of subclasses and new spells being coughed up every day, and most of them are unofficial. Most of them, actually, I think if I heard correctly, at the time of this recording, D&D Beyond is talking about making it so that dungeon masters can share stuff with their players again, instead of making them subscribe to D&D Beyond, which is really cool. And I don't have that problem with Dragonbane, obviously, because Dragonbane doesn't even use classes and no subclasses or any of that nonsense. I mean, yeah, there's professions and skills and heroic abilities and all that good stuff. But yeah, I mean, people are still encouraged, I think, to be creative with things. Now, you have to be kind of careful what you post on Reddit, and you have to kind of be careful with what you post on, X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, or D&D Beyond even, because I've seen we'll get that in post. I've seen dungeon tubers I've seen dungeon tubers go through, homebrew D&D Beyond stuff and just rip it to shreds, which kind of makes me sad in a way, because I know some of these people are like doing things outrageously, on purpose to get attention or to use in their home campaign because it's so ridiculously unbalanced, and the game master or the dungeon master will be just completely, hopeless if they allow it. And unfortunately for some new DMs, that's some of these new DMs especially fall for it, and then they've got characters that are completely out of control. And that's kind of one of those campaign ending things that happens early on, especially when you're just learning the game. And I've seen it happen. My One of my sons, in fact, went to his local D&D club with something that just made my eyes water just looking at it, but you couldn't talk him out of it for nothing. I'm like, okay, couldn't talk him out of it for nothing. So I said, you know what? Okay, go ahead and try it. And I don't think that campaign lasted more than a week. Maybe 2. Um, because yeah, he and I didn't even help him. Like he did all this on his own. Like I didn't even touch it. But yeah, it was a little out of balance. I think probably. At least I would have called it out of balance. But hey, you know what? What works at my table might not work at yours, and vice versa, and that's how it goes. The main thing I think about homebrew anything, whether it's a homebrew product that you've picked up online, whether it's homebrew you've come up with yourself as a dungeon master or game master and you want to spring it on your players, or whether it's something you've come up with as a player that you want to introduce into the game, I think these discussions are really important to have. I know some of the older guys are going to cringe when I say this, but it's really important to have that discussion at session 0. Rock it from there and get everybody kind of on the same page, as to what's expected and what's allowed and what's maybe not allowed. Like me personally, I would lay down that, we're not doing homebrew, psionics. We're not doing psionics, period. In fact, get that stuff away from my table. Um, but in terms of D&D, there's a lot of do's and don'ts. And with Dragonbane's one happy big green rule book or one big green box, and the core rules are the same between both. And it's a very basic, very simple game, and there's still plenty of room for homebrew, both on my side of the table as a game master and as a designer. And there's plenty of room on the other side of the table for the players to get kind of creative with stuff, as long as they don't go crazy. Um, And I'll let a lot of things fly. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I try to be pretty cool with player ideas. I can think of some third edition D&D moments where wife, who was playing a druid, got pretty creative with her shape shifting and spell casting and stuff. And sometimes I still wonder. But anyway, that villain died horribly. The villain I'm thinking of died horribly. I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. It's been real fun. Again, I will just say, to kind of wrap it all up, homebrew is a good thing. And, we would not have the cottage industry that is tabletop role playing games if it were not for homebrew and people creating their own stuff. So please, please, please keep the creativity flowing. Keep coming up with your own material. Keep coming up with your own material. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for stopping by.